Exactly. This is lesson 2 in our series, Get This In AKC FAST. I'd like to start today by reviewing what we did in lesson 1, maybe add a little bit to it. First thing we talked about was the need to get your dog up to speed as you're entering the send. This is because you have to build momentum, because you need that force to get your dog beyond the line to the first or maybe even the second jump, because you can't go in there with your dog. We also talked about you having to determine for yourself what it's going to take to get your dog up to speed. For me, my dog, I figure I need about 25 feet. Of course, your dog is different, so you have to make that assessment for yourself. Second thing we talked about was not doing anything to kill your momentum all the way into the send. We talked about coming out of the weaves and maybe taking the A-frame, and how some of those things for certain dogs can kill momentum. I know with my dog, the A-frame kills momentum. Maybe with your dog is different. But just pay attention to what you're doing on the way into the send. And don't be so stubborn as to go for points when that's going to ruin your momentum, because you have to get the momentum to get the send often. And if you don't get the send, you don't get the cue. Okay, third, we talked about the importance of cueing the send while you're still in motion. You don't go up to the line and say, go with your arm, because then you're stopped. And motion is the strongest cue. You want your motion to be consistent with your send cue. So you want to say go and move your arm while you're still in motion. And that means chances are you're going to have to do those cues when you're like 5, 10, or 15 feet away from the send line. Now, when this happens, there comes a point where your dog is starting to focus more on where it's going and less on you. It's dependent on your motion while it's running alongside you, but when you give your send cues along with the momentum, there comes a point where they're more independent. They're focusing on where they're going. I like to call that a point of like separation, when you're pretty sure they're going to go there. And when you're sure they're going to go there, you're then a little free to move around, maybe moving in ways that are inconsistent with the way they're going, like you're moving to the side. But it's important that you move to the side and do different things, because you need to set yourself up to handle the dog after they take the first jump. Oftentimes you have to move away from the line. We'll cover that later, but you're waiting until you're pretty sure the dog is going to go to the jump when you can start moving in those new directions. It's sort of similar to the concept of commitment. Commitment is when you are certain your dog is going to take a jump or obstacle, and I always say you should cue the obstacle until commitment. So you cue the dog till they take the jump, and when they're committed to it, you can then turn another way, because they're committed, they're going to do it anyway. You're not going to pull them off of it. Remember in the introduction we talked about the A-frame example where you're sending the dog to the A-frame, but you turn this way and the dog follows you? Well, the way to fix that would be to not turn as inconsistent with what the dog is doing until the dog is committed. So you cue until commitment. This is a similar concept, but it's a little iffier because the dog has often quite a distance to go. So it's really not commitment. I like to say it's, you got to be pretty darn sure the dog is going to take it before you start moving. Similar concept. You're waiting until the dog is separate from you. Separation. I like that word, separation. And then you can move about to where you want to be to negotiate the second and third jump in the send. Okay, that's our review and a little addition to it. And let's go on to the subject at hand for today. Last week we talked about building up the speed of your dog to build momentum to go into the send. And that's probably true most of the time in most sends. However, there are times when you don't want a lot of speed and momentum going into the send, like an example like this. You know, when you're going fast, you have less influence over your dog. When you're going slow, your cues are a lot more effective. And in a situation like this where the dog could easily just go right into the off-course tunnel, you don't want a lot of speed. So the point is very simple. It's not always speed going into the send. If you have like any kind of technical thing, you'd rather the dog go slower. Now I want to give you another example of starting a send with a lot of speed. And let's take a look at this chart right here. Tell you what, I'm going to give you a few minutes. First, let me just tell you that nobody went in from the bottom, straight to the A-frame, because there was a built-in layer, and unless you have really good trained behavior, layers are hard unless you have a trained behavior. So why don't you take a look at it for a minute and see how you'd handle it, and I'll talk about it in a second. As always, if you want to pause and think about it, that's a good idea. Okay, it's a pretty interesting send because what I did and everybody else did pretty much was we came in like this. You can see where I my lines. We did a 180, and the 180 put a dog on the angle back toward the A-frame, and then you use your motion and your arm cues and your voice, and you can get them up the A-frame, and that's how you start your send. It's a 180 entry into a send. That's just another good tool to have in your box. I use that 180 entry every now and then. It's really good if the second obstacle in the send is further back in the send. So you don't have to spend so much effort getting them from the first to the second by pushing them out. We'll talk about that later. But sometimes you can't get in a position to do other techniques. This is just a good technique to get your dog over that first jump and continue back into the send. So just keep that in mind when you're walking courses.